Hello and welcome to a new video format where I will be attempting to do some educational content as well as introduce you to my own opinions, my own thoughts on things at the same time. So, today we're going to be talking about Hegel and skepticism. Now, both of these are very broad, complicated topics, of course, and so in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the important ways that I feel they intersect and they cross over, and some important ideas among the two of them. And that means we're not only talking about what Hegel thought about skepticism, although that will be a big part of the video. We're also going to be talking about what exactly skepticism is and how it applies to philosophy at this time and in the time of Hegel. So, let's begin with some background on what exactly skepticism is, or what it means to me. Of course, skepticism has two forms, typically, and this is a distinction that Hegel will use himself in his writings, and that is still remains to this day, which is a distinction between ancient and modern skepticism. Now, ancient skepticism goes back to Greece. It's associated with the term Pyrrhonism, and this is associated with this figure who supposedly had an ultra-skeptic philosophy, which we're acquainted with through secondary texts, people who wrote about him at the time, and basically doubted everything, asked questions, intensely doubted things. This kind of philosophy, of course, was ignored and ridiculed for the most part, which is why we don't exactly consider it or think of it when we think of Greek philosophy generally. And that is because people like Plato, Aristotle wanted to, of course, transcend it. Yet, nonetheless, it's undeniable, and you can see it mentioned in various bits of philosophy. For example, in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, where, of course, Cicero is a Roman, and he wrote for the Roman audience, but he was intensely interested in Greek philosophy, and at this time it was viewed that Greek philosophy was superior to Roman philosophy. In fact, any philosophy at all ought to be Greek, even in the time of the end of the Roman Republic. And even Cicero would mention the skeptical ideas when he's discussing the nature of gods, but he mostly dismisses them in favor of actual constructive, specific ideas about the nature of gods. However, what's interesting here is that in this text, Cicero is effectively using his skeptical main character as someone who does indeed question everything that the other sides say. So when the Epicurean representative or the Stoic representative, two major schools of philosophy at that time, when they describe their opinions on the nature of gods, he will question them, undermine them, and his name is Coda, and this is the main character of sorts, the voice of Cicero, and he will consistently undermine the other characters and put them on a very modern playing field. He comes off like an atheist, who's constantly seeking to undermine his opponents, who doesn't really believe in gods, is unable to believe in gods, and finds flaws in every argument. In this sense, we get the idea that a skeptic, outside of truly doubting everything, can also be a dialectical tool to find the truth of things. Indeed, Cicero remarks at the end of the text that he was more convinced by the Stoic representative, not the skeptic that he used as a device, we could say, for critiquing and understanding what these perspectives used. Hegel views classical skepticism as such a tool, that there is a dialectical necessity as part of a process in this form of skepticism, or skepticism generally. And we will be returning to this later. Now that we've put ancient skepticism aside, we're going to move on to what we would call modern skepticism. Now, of course, this was considered modern skepticism in the time of Hegel, and we would still call it modern skepticism because in the grand scheme of things, we haven't really transcended the 1700s, 1800s views of philosophy is much more effectively modern than anything in ancient Greece is for us today. It is absolutely incomprehensible in comparison to what thinkers of that time were dealing with. Now, what I would like to use as my preeminent skeptic philosopher is David Hume. Now, I don't want to get too far into Hume in this video because, of course, Hume is not the topic of this video, but I consider Hume to be the preeminent representative of the skeptics in a way that I believe that Kant and possibly Hegel also held him to be. Now, why is this? Well, Hume was incredibly skeptical of morality as a universal applicable formula, and to the extent that morality did exist, he chalked it up to preferences and customs that humans had over time that were not due to some objective measure, but were absolutely relative to the situation at the given time. So, for example, we believe that charity is a good thing, a good trait. But Hume basically argues that charity is only a good trait because the distribution of goods in our society is such that it helps people to, give them extra goods every now and then. But if we imagine a society in which everyone had the same, or had nothing, or had infinite number of goods, we would not view charity the same way. It would fundamentally change our moral system in that sense. And thus, morality seems to be not so much some objective, God-derived set of norms, but rather something that is relative, culturally defined, and could even change over time. By contrast, or in addition to that, in the metaphysical realm, where of course there was centuries of metaphysical philosophers and Christian theologians who seeked to find the fundamental truths of the universe, which would organize all of life, nature, existence, and morality, of course, Hume was immensely skeptical to those questions, famously critiquing the idea of cause and effect. Hume had the famous example of the billiard balls in which we would hit them, and we don't actually have an objective metaphysical necessity that we could know, a truth, to the idea that the ball would move in a certain direction when we hit them. How is this the case? Well, ultimately, we don't have an explanation for why whatever law we've empirically observed in science would always apply in that case. We cannot prove specifically what the form or the force that affects that instance is, and thus ultimately we would have to remain agnostic, in a sense, to the truth of that claim, to the absolute truth. Now, of course, we must get to another important aspect of Hume here, which is that while Hume felt that ultimately morality and metaphysical truth was something we could not access, indeed we could access custom and habit in the same way that we have a habit of expecting what the billiard ball would do, and ultimately we could rely on this as long as we were honest with ourselves about the truth and the metaphysical claim. In this sense, Hume has sort of two narratives at a time. He has an applied sense of morality and metaphysics, which contradicts his ultimate metaphysical opinion on things. There's a separation between these two areas. Now, this is where things can become complicated. For instance, some people say that David Hume is a naturalist and not a skeptic, because truly David Hume relies on the natural behaviors and natural conditions of our human lives. He is not skeptical about them, rather he's skeptical about anything outside of them. He has a sort of pragmatic application to truth. But ultimately, Hume is an ultimate skeptic because he undermines everything about the metaphysics and the morality of the time, indeed, philosophy itself. Now, this leads to Kant's rejection of Hume. Kant was, in some respects, influenced by Hume, and Kant felt that Hume was correct about many of his assertions, including the impossibility of certain metaphysical claims, but that Hume did not apply his scheme consistently enough. Hume's acknowledging of science should have led him to understand that there was something objective and provable about scientific categories and about other categories, and so Kant extended what we could call the subjective analysis of the subject and sought to assess it critically, use the skeptical method dialectically and critically again, in order to find out positively what indeed we can assert about the human experience and have some sense of a universal human experience constructed based on this process. So we would no longer be left in a forest of doubt and darkness that Hume may leave us in. Rather, we would have a constructive understanding of what exactly we could know, knowing that certain things we will not know, but ultimately we would have a sense of universal morality and universal categories and universal practical reason that would arise out of our universality as subjects. Now this arises the modern German idealist tradition, the German philosophical period of Hegel, and indeed the very subject of our video. So, after Kant, all of German philosophy was affected by him, either by rejections of him, incorporations of him, rejections that also incorporated him, and all of these such developments. And we should also understand historically that this was at the same time of the French Revolution, or the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, and the rule of Napoleon, and the whether you look at it as counter-revolutionary response to the revolution, or the expansion of the revolution, the turn of the revolution, all of these very difficult problems arose. And they all happened to happen at the same time as philosophy was experiencing revolutions. Well, it seems to me, and this is where my argument comes in, it seems to me, and I also have sources for this point, but it seems to me that at this time, Germany was experiencing a philosophical problem that went back to the very problem of skepticism that Kant tried to overcome. Now, Kant is very dismissive of skepticism, although he also appreciates its utility. He does appreciate its utility and its ability to criticize and discover the positive truth claims about what we can know, but he sees it as sort of an adolescent period. He uses that metaphor explicitly, in the sense that skeptics are unable to reach the full maturity of discovering what is true. They may be more informed than the childlike dogmatism that was popular at the time, the metaphysical absoluteness that we imagine Christian theologians especially to have, but we should also understand that many Enlightenment, perhaps not as zealous Christians, who also were part of the Enlightenment and also believed in this sort of dogmatism, were all criticized by Kant, and skeptics were relegated to this middle position. Now, this leads us to an important historical event, which I think is something we must understand, and this is an article put forth by Paul Franks in his book, All or Nothing. And this argument is essentially that the Spinoza controversy in Germany about Kant, which we will get to, is heavily reliant on a fear of and a response to skepticism. Now, before we get to the Spinoza controversy and Paul Frank's view on it, we should cover one more thing, which is the idea of what exactly the skeptical problem was and how we can conceive of Kant specifically fighting it. Now, what Paul Franks argues is that the ultimate skeptical inquiry that would undermine everything that there is to be believed in, which can be traced back to our ancient skepticism, was such a problem that we can see explicitly in the philosophy of individuals like Leibniz and Kant after him, responding to and trying to overcome it. How is this the case? Well, to put it in very simple terms, essentially, the attempt of philosophers was to objectively justify philosophy through God. They felt that God would be the ultimate grounding of all things. Thus, there is objectivity, there is morality, there is philosophy itself. That grounding that we can secure allows us to escape ultimate skepticism. However, in order to do that, you had to overcome an incredibly complex problem. That is, how do we connect God, philosophically, to our finite, flawed, and personal and subjective world that we experience? So Leibniz was attempting to connect the flawed, finite, confused world and trace it to and connect it to God, and connect them in some way that wouldn't contradict each element. Now, when we put it in these terms, we can see that the so-called dogmatic philosophers, like Leibniz, were ultimately dealing with these problems in similar ways, and we can escape some of the polemics that Kant uses about transforming philosophy and realize that as much value as Kant brings, he's still dealing with fundamentally similar problems. Now, with that note out of the way, we get to, and build on that, with the Spinoza controversy. Now, the Spinoza controversy that happened when Kant was alive, but he engaged with it in a limited form, and ultimately its impact was far greater on his successors. What it was a popular philosopher of the time, very influential, Jacobi, who engaged with Kant and criticized him on the ground that he was essentially a Spinozist. Now, Kant himself seemed to be dismissive of Spinoza and not have very much interest in him, but Jacobi made the argument that ultimately Kant relies on an interconnected universality of things, albeit through subjectivity, and thus Kant was essentially a Spinozist. Now, Jacobi meant this very negatively, because for Jacobi, philosophy and rationalism, epitomized in Spinoza, and thus Kant, was a circle that was doomed to fail. You would never be able to justify everything. You would only be able to justify everything in some nihilistic, determinate sense that was not fulfilled, and thus you would fail the skeptical problem and the problem of meaning and in life. And essentially the only way to overcome this was to have some form of faith, some sort of faith in immediate knowing, immediate knowledge, what we would consider a very typical Christian mystical argument, but built on a very sophisticated engagement with philosophy itself. Because Jacobi really had a deep fear of this skeptical problem. He truly felt that you had to be able to ground everything out, as we mentioned, ground everything in God, and he felt that philosophy was an attempt to use reason to ground everything out in a way that reason was not up to the task for. Now, we should mention that many other skeptical philosophers, such as Schulz, were attempting to demonstrate how Kant did not succeed past the skeptical problem, for his entire scheme relied on the assertion of a subjective experience, something which he did not prove, and these sort of skeptical issues that undermined his exact application of things like his attempt to secure objective morality, all of these were prey for skepticism, rearticulation, and such things like this. So the Spinoza controversy had an incredibly interesting effect, because what it actually did is it made a lot of people accept Spinoza. Kant indeed said, well, you might be right, perhaps I am a Spinozist, but more importantly, the successive generation of philosophers, such as Schelling and Hegel, accepted Spinoza. Indeed, Hegel would say that to be a philosopher at all meant accepting Spinoza, and if you did not, you would be pre-philosophical in some sense. Now, what did they mean by this? Well, remember, the whole point of Jacobi's argument was that you needed to have a Spinozistic, Kantian connection of all things in order to justify, through reason, philosophy. Hegel and Schelling essentially take on this charge, especially Hegel, and they say, you are right, thus we are Spinozist. Spinoza is the only way to demonstrate the true interconnectivity of all things, to justify God existing in all things, to justify the ground of objective morality, and to connect all of these together, including the subjective experience, which was ultimately uncovered in a truer sense in Kant. And this is essentially the task of Hegel. Now, we mention all of this, and we should also mention that Hegel was critical of Jacobi's idea that everything could be known immediately, because of course he rather takes up the opposition of Spinoza. He is happy to take up that opposition, although he values greatly Jacobi's contribution to uncover this problem, which really demonstrates that he thinks there's something true and penetrating about Jacobi's criticism of reason, and thus Jacobi's speculative or skeptical enterprise. Now, Hegel also has another target, another thing that he's highly skeptical of, and that is indeed skepticism itself. Hegel writes in 1802 a work dealing with skepticism and dealing with Scholz, who I mentioned previously as someone who felt that Kant had not properly justified his argumentation. And Hegel essentially believes that skepticism is inferior. And again, as mentioned, it is important and necessary as a dialectical movement, a tool, something that consciousness works through in order to achieve truth, such as it could be applied in the case of Cicero's On the Nature of Gods, or some of the ancient skeptics generally, but that modern skepticism had taken skepticism to not be simply a dialectical move. Rather, it had embraced skepticism as such. It had thrown up its hands. It felt it was unable to discover the truth of things, and thus it undermined things like Kant. And for Hegel, he felt this was immature and insufficient. Skepticism relies on assumptions about the world which it itself cannot justify. And ultimately, Hegel was always infinitely more sympathetic to the reasoned, educated task of understanding the world in a way which would align in some degree with Spinoza. And so he was immensely critical towards skepticism. One other example of skepticism we can see being directly dealt with in Hegel is in the Phenomenology of Spirit, where indeed the skeptical consciousness is a form of the consciousness, a moment of consciousness. Remember, in Hegel, moments of consciousness are all necessary, part of the consciousness itself, consciousness understanding itself. And one of these said moments is skepticism. And skepticism for Hegel, in the Phenomenology, contradicts itself because it finds that it must exist in the world. It must eat. And despite its attempt to recede into the habits of its own mind, into the idealism of its own mind, and it attempts to undermine the outside world on the justification that its own mind is the only thing that exists and is thus flawed, ultimately it must eat. It must partake in the world around it. It finds that it has desires, it has natural instincts, it has a world outside of it, and thus its task is indefinitely unfulfilled. It becomes an unhappy consciousness. This is Hegel's particular phrase. And this is why, because it cannot satisfy this incoherent and contradictory demand. And so we can find that Hegel is really immensely skeptical towards skepticism, but also that it is a necessary thing, that it is necessary to critique and understand the limits. And so Hegel has some limited form of sympathy for skepticism as a tool, as a moment, but not in and of itself, not for itself, remaining in itself permanently. Now that we've established the general themes, the general development, and the general story of things here, I would like to elaborate a bit more on how I interpret these things and what this means to me. Now, if we all agree that Hegel is a complicated thinker, but one that we can say for certain is using a Spinozistic connection of all things in order to objectively deduce the moments and the change that are necessary and unfolding and yet rational and decipherable. If Hegel is this kind of thinker, where he's not simply outlining a system which can understand the entire world, he is outlining a system which is self-understanding, which is a movement, which includes contradiction and all of these things. It is not this idea of a system which is outlined and then remains in place for all eternity. Rather, it is a system which is itself open to change. The difference is that skepticism appears to be not open to change. It appears to assert that certain claims and certain ideas are impossible to know. Now, this has a political dimension to it. People will often point to the fact that David Hume, who we mentioned before as the preeminent example of a skeptic, was something of a conservative in the case of England. He wrote a history of England, and in it he appeared to prefer the conservative regime, the norms, the way that things had been to remain the same, and he was very skeptical, it turns out, towards any movement for change, radicalism, etc. On the other hand, we know that Hegel has been eagerly adopted by especially Marxists and leftists in general, Indeed, it would seem that no other group has adopted Hegel so much. As much as discussion has been had by Karl Popper and others that Hegel also justifies fascism and Nazism, it seems quite clear to say that the project of fascism and Nazism were much less justified or encouraged by Hegel in any sense than what Marxism was. Indeed, Marx himself frequently spoke about Hegel, was heavily influenced by Hegel, and heavily influenced by thinkers of Hegel, and overall was a much more direct related phenomenon than fascism ever was. This is not to say that it would be impossible to draw a line between Hegel and fascism, but that frankly this must be dealt with separately and in a different manner, and one that I will not be taking up much in this video. Rather, I would like to talk more about the fact that Hegel is taken up as a revolutionary figure, as a revolutionary philosopher, in contrast to the skepticism of Hume. Now, the reason for this, and we can imagine it quite clearly by how I've outlined it, is that Hegel includes change. Hegel includes a critique and understanding of change. And it's easy to see how Marxism, as something which is trying to critique the forms of things as they are given to us, and trying to understand how indeed the consciousness can change and develop over time, would find immense benefit in Hegel to justify how there could be a revolution, how there could be contradiction, how the forms of society are so necessary and yet so open to change through their necessity. This philosophy that we find in Hegel is much more open to conditions of revolution than Hume. Hume would say simply, this is how things are, there is no other truth, and it would seem that there is not the same sort of revolutionary impetus behind skepticism in this way. Now, for that reason, there is a consistent argument about Hegel, about whether Hegel is able to be taken up as this immense peak of the Enlightenment who understands contradiction, understands thought itself, and indeed understands the revolution. But this is, and must be, reconciled with the fact that Hegel himself was something of a moderate liberal. At the time, of course, this would have meant revolutionary in some sense. He was in the Prussian state. He was endorsing of the French Revolution in part. And so it would seem that he was a revolutionary of the time, of the liberal bourgeois sense, but that ultimately he was sympathetic to Christian ideals, the Christian philosophical Protestant development, the Prussian state, in some sense, as long as it would open itself up and be developed by ideas of democracy. And it may seem, with this information, more confusing how he would be taken up by Marxists. And indeed, there is a disagreement that remains to this very day of how to take up Hegel. Again, we have reactionaries and fascists who have been influenced by Hegel. We have conservatives who are taken to take up Hegel in his defense of Christianity and the state. And we have liberals who take up Hegel and take him up in a more analytical, what we would assume as a Anglo tradition for philosophy. And of course, we have the Marxist radical leftists taking up of Hegel. And so we have a problem of hermeneutics, and ultimately that would mean how we must read Hegel, how we must read Hegel's development, and due to the nature of Hegel's writing, the amount of it, and the confusing historical grappling with Hegel, there is indeed ground to be seized, ground to be fought over what Hegel should mean. Now, why do I bring up all this? Well, ultimately, I come here to assert that there needs to be a recapitulation of what Hegel thought and of re-dealing with Hegel. Some would like to completely dismiss Hegel and dismiss him as indeed a irrational, questionable psychological derivation of Kant. And others would like to say that that Hegel was a peak of Enlightenment philosophy. and that truly we have transcended philosophy. We have different tasks today. We must take Hegel for granted, and we must apply him and understand how things have changed in the capitalist state, and ultimately we must overthrow and revolutionize the capitalist state. In either case, I think there is a sense that Hegel must be taken for granted, and in this light, it must be taken for granted that skepticism is overcome. However, I think we need to be more frank about the presuppositions that we bring into these conversations. When one says that skepticism is overcome, ultimately what they are saying is that they are convinced. They are convinced of Hegel's argument, and that there is no more to be said on the subject. When someone says they are a skeptic, it is thus sought that it seems to be the case that someone who says they are a skeptic is a political reactionary, that they are counter-revolutionary, and that they are not convinced of this necessary truth, and thus in some way they are regressive, that they are pre-philosophy. What I want to argue for is no one really does believe in Hegel, and no one really does believe in skepticism, and thus a greater process of grappling with these texts and grappling with our moment must be taken. How many truly believe in their heart that Hegel's contradiction and Hegel's developments are still in place? It seems to be the case that Marxism itself has abandoned Hegel. Many will argue simply that Marx was no Hegelian at all. Some, for instance, Mike McNair from the Communist Party of Great Britain will argue that Kant and Hegel were counter-revolutionary, and that actually Lockean empiricism was what Marx was more interested in, what Marx was built on. Indeed, many Marxists believe that psychoanalysis and theory and Zizek are the correct path forward, and it must be said that all of these are inspired by Hegel, but are, in another sense, immensely critical of Hegel. It is said that Zizek is, of course, more sympathetic and more directly related to Schelling than Hegel, especially late Schelling. And it is, of course, said that the Lacanian French tradition builds on a version of Hegel which is no Hegel at all, and is ultimately anti-Hegelian. And so it would seem that the modern left is barely Hegelian. And to the extent that it is Hegelian, it's Hegelian in a very desperate, hopeful, optimistic sense, in which it hopes to the idea, it clings to the idea that Enlightenment philosophy has been secured, except the very principles of the bourgeois Enlightenment and the bourgeois revolution are held to such a very few that it would seem to be quite shaky ground. And indeed, it would seem that skepticism would naturally arise in our current moment, that this could be written off as a problem of capitalism and structure, that skepticism arises, and perhaps it is the case. But nevertheless, that means to me that skepticism and its ability to critique dialectically all moments and all movements must be engaged in. And while it may be immensely unsatisfying and worrying and concerning to hang your hat on skepticism, as David Hume did, and it may be at risk of becoming a conservative, it seems to me that it is far more conservative to cling to the hope that Hegel was correct, without clinging to knowing that Hegel was correct. It seems that no one can claim that Hegel was correct, that such a fact is known, that everyone has a skeptical impulse inside them if they are honest, and everyone has a skeptical incentive to, or a skeptical drive to self-criticize and know. Ultimately, my point with all of this is to say that we need more skepticism and more Hegel. We need to acquaint ourselves with the struggle that existed in Germany after the French Revolution. We need to acquaint ourselves with the idea that everything may fall prey to skepticism, and that everything must not fall prey to skepticism, as Hegel reminds us. The only true way to transcend this problem, as Hegel felt that he did, is to undertake it ourselves. For if all we can do is rely on the fact that it has been done, I believe that is the true regressive pre-philosophy. Now, ultimately, many problems have been briefly raised or gestured at, and my video is certainly not an all-encompassing look at this subject, far from it. And I look forward to having more discussions about this topic and referencing it more on my channel, as it is, of course, one of the most interesting things to me, and it will probably remain so. I want to thank all of you for watching, and I hope that my point, although imperfect, will shine through in some sense, and it will be a jumping-off point for further discussion. And I am open to any questions, comments, anything that you believe is very important to keep in mind with the story, a correction, anything of that matter. Thank you for watching, and I do hope to do more content like this in the future, but we'll see. Thank you all once again, and I'll see you again sometime soon.